lessons from the IT industry to accelerate growth of the Indian economy. For today's session, I have the honor to be co-hosting with Dr. Aman Agarwal of the Indian Institute of Finance. He was also our speaker for our August Technovate session. As for me, once again, my name is Joya Scarlata, and I am part of the digital marketing team here at Intera IT. So for those who have never attended a session before, I just wanted to give a very brief overview of Technovate. It is a monthly event where we invite speakers to discuss timely and relevant topics on a range of issues, from upcoming technology trends to management and strategy to sales and marketing. We always announce our upcoming events on our website as well as our social media channels, so please be on the lookout for them. Before we get started, as always, I just wanted to cover some very basic housekeeping rules. Please do not forget to mute yourself and hold off all questions till the end of the session. If you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can private message Dr. Agarwal or myself in the chat, and we will do our best to get to them all. Also, the session will be recorded, and we will provide the recording after the session. With that being said, I am very excited to introduce today's speaker and topic. It goes without saying that India is an IT powerhouse. In 2020, India's tech sector made up around 8% of its GDP, and the domestic enterprise ICT market is projected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of around 7% for the next 5 years. So I don't think we can argue that the IT industry is and will continue to grow at a very steady rate. However, what are the factors that have led us here? What has contributed India to become this IT powerhouse, and how does it factor and contribute to its overall economic development? Well, our esteemed speaker, Dr. Lalit Kanodia, will address this and more. It is an absolute honor to have Dr. Kanodia with us. He is the founder and chairman of the Datamatics Group of companies. Datamatics provides consulting, IT, data management, and business process management services. After doing his PhD in management at MIT, of which he was the first Indian to do so, he returned to India to form and head the Software Development Center for the Tata Group. This was initially known as the Tata Computer Center, which is now known as Tata Consultancy Services, or TCS. He has held a number of prominent positions. He was the former president of the Management Consultants of India, an executive board member of MIT, and the national president of the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. He is currently on the advisory board of Bombay University. So please help me welcome Dr. Kanodia. Dr. Kanodia, it's on to you.
Thank you very much. I'm excited that I'm speaking to such a distinguished audience today. I would like to thank my friend Ashok Laha for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm looking forward to Professor Agarwal's comments. And I'm delighted that we have an audience of about 150 people, including members of your company, Intera, the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, and others. So, gentlemen, the subject today is lessons from the IT industry to accelerate or spur the growth of the Indian economy. Now, both these subjects are very near and dear to me. IT, I'm an IT professional in my career and an economist, thanks to my background at MIT, where I had 3 Nobel laureates in economics as my professors. So I think there's a confluence between IT and economics, And I think our great success in the IT field can give a lot of pointers to how India can accelerate its economic development, which I believe is the need of the hour. So I really think I'll call upon my experience and my education to try and paint a picture and try to give some of my opinion on how our learning from the IT sector can influence the economic growth of India. I would like to add that I believe in what our National Security Advisor has repeated, Mr. Doval has said on many occasions, that the greatest teacher is history. So I think we need to learn from history as to what we are doing right and what we are doing wrong. For example, let us look at North versus South Korea. South Korea has done brilliantly well, economically speaking. East and West Germany, where the West has done much better than the East, and of course the Soviet Union. So I think we need to draw lessons from these experiences to see what we can do correctly, because the need of the hour, without any question, is to accelerate our economic growth. Let me spend a few minutes on our past, which all of us should be extremely proud of. I think we Indians have so much behind us that we can look up to the world and say that, look, hey, we are the oldest living civilization which has taught the world so many things. Most of you may know the fact that in 1780, India had about 25% of the world GDP, which is what the USA has approximately today. We had the first two universities in the world, Taxila and Nalanda. And they're all list of inventions and discoveries that have never, unfortunately, been documented, that we can be very proud of. For example, we invented stainless steel. The Qutub Minar pillar, which is 1600 years old, has not rusted. We discovered calculus. We knew the value of pi. Some of you may be surprised to know that the very first operation, Caesarean operation in the world, was done by Chanakya on the wife of Chandragupta Maurya, which what goal is there in geography, you see? Bhu-goal. So we knew that Earth is round. We knew 1,000 years ago, or more than 1,000 years ago, that there were planets. We knew about Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. The world discovered it, I don't know when, a few hundred years ago. We've known this for over 1,000 years. As you know, we call them Navgraha in all our, when we pray. We've been world travelers. And one of the examples I give of this is a princess from Ayodhya, Suri Ratna, who sailed all the way to Korea around 50 AD and married the king of Korea. Mind you, this is 2,000 years ago. And they had 12 children. And many of the children have become presidents and prime minister of Korea. And the Koreans have built a memorial for her in Ayodhya that we Indians don't even know about it. Today, in fact, for many hundred years, the world wanted to come to India. They looked up to India. As long back as 300 BC, Alexander the Great came to India. Columbus discovered the United States or America because he wanted to come to India. The fact of the matter is, just as most of us want to travel to the United States or Europe, in those days, everybody wanted to come to India. But we had set an example to the whole world. Then unfortunately, I think we went through a very rough patch for the last 1,000-odd years. Starting with 1001, Muhammad Ghazni came to India 17 times and he looted temples and the country. Thereafter, Muhammad Ghori, starting at about 200 years later, 1175, came to India and looted India 7 times. Bakhtiyar Khilji came to India and burned Nalanda in 1200 AD. So the initial invaders came to India to loot and to take away our wealth. Fortunately, the subsequent invaders settled down here and made India their home, which we are very fortunate that happened. They didn't loot India. They may have accumulated wealth, but they lived here, they married here, their children were born here, and they made India their home. For example, the Lodhis, Sikandar and Ibrahim Lodhi, in the mid-1400s, ruled from Delhi. The Mughals, starting with Babur, from 1526 to 1857, with 330-odd years, again made India their home. As you know, Jahangir's mother was a Rajasthani from Rajasthan, father was a Muslim, so he was half and half. And a lot of the Mughals married into the Indian population. Hyder and Tipu Ali, 1766 to 1782, which ruled from Mysore, again made India their home. So this period, which is about 500-600 years, they did not loot India, but they made India their home and they lived here. Then, in my personal opinion, we went through a traumatic experience with the British, which is not well documented. The British, a Columbia University study shows, took away from India $43 trillion. Rate, $43 trillion. Now, that's an enormous amount of money. And the share of India's GDP in the world economy shrank from 25% to 3% or below 3%. So I think India went through very once in a while it'll drop off. I don't know why. Anyway, can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me now.
Yes.
So I think the first few invaders looted India. For 400 or 500 years, they settled down and lived in India and made it their home. And the British again, in a way, looted India. So India, from 25% GDP, world GDP, shrank to less than 3%. Now let's talk briefly about what happened post-independence. I think all of us thought that now that we are independent, we had reached nirvana, and India would now grow automatically. We did not understand the importance of economics, and we did not know how important the subject is to guide the country in its economic growth. Also, unfortunately, we turned left. We copied the USSR model. And many of you may know that instead of relying on an economist, we relied on Mahalanobis, who was a statistician from the ISI, Calcutta, and he in turn relied on the Leontief matrix. And I think that was a huge, huge disaster. Our government relied on public sector units. And they said that the public sector units would occupy commanding heights of the economy. For example, Air India. And all of you know what happened to the public sector, including Air India. So I think we went through a very dismal period at that point in time. And our economy grew at less than 3%, which is below the world average. And therefore, our share of the world economy further shrank. It did not increase till 1991. And we'll talk about 1991. We invented the word crony capitalism. I've never heard the word elsewhere. where they thought that somehow businessmen cheat the economy. But they don't realize the fact, the government does not realize the fact, that it's businessmen who create jobs and it's businessmen who grow the GDP. And this is evident from the fact that the sole recipient of the Bharat Ratna from the business community is the one and only G.R.D. Tata, whom I was very, very fortunate to work for. But that shows the importance that the government laid to the business sector. We also failed in education. We are very proud of the IITs and IIMs, but the fact of the matter is that 81% of the India's population was illiterate in 1947. I repeat, 81%. Even today, we are at 25%. So 1 out of 4 Indians don't know how to read and write. So I personally think it's been a failure, despite the IITs and IIM. We devalued the rupee. You may be surprised to hear that the dollar was equal to 1 rupee in 1947. I repeat, the dollar was 1 rupee in 1947. And today it is 75. When I went to study in the United States in 1963, I paid 5 rupees to a dollar. So I think on that front also we have, in my opinion, failed. When I came back in 67, you may be surprised to note that there was a ceiling on salaries. No employee could draw more than 5 lakhs per year. Sounds very funny today, right? But that's what we did. We introduced wealth tax, one of the very few countries in the world, and it is a complete disaster in my opinion, because once you've paid tax on your income, there's no reason why you should pay tax again in terms of wealth tax. And our tax rate grew to over 100% of our income. I know some very wealthy families very well who cried that how can we pay more tax than our income? But if we add income tax and wealth tax, it is more than the annual income. But that's what happened. We had no tax on agriculture, which I think has been a huge problem. If you see all the politicians, they declare agricultural wealth for reasons which I'm sure all of you understand, which I think set us back. When I was president of IMC, I submitted a paper to the government that tax agriculture income, if it is more than 1 crore. Surely, if your income is more than 1 crore, even if you're a farmer, you can pay tax. But no, the government won't even look at it. So it's very unfortunate in my opinion. Let's not look at the positive side. This is negative, but there are some positives. What are the positives? We created a stable democracy. I think I give full marks to the government on that front. If you see our neighbors, Pakistan, Myanmar, and many other countries, they are not stable democracies. So we certainly created a stable democracy. The institutes of high learning, IIT, IIM, Indian Institute of Science, and so on, are wonderful. And I think a lot of the progress that we've made is because of these institutes. And last but not the least, the subject that I'm talking about, information technology. I think that's the brightest star that we have in our economy. We have shown the world that when we want to, we can deliver. We are as good, if not better than everybody else in the world. So I think it's a shining example which set us apart. And the Prime Minister of India, whenever he travels abroad, talks of IT. The whole world talks of IT. So I think there is a lesson to be learned from that sector. So what did we do right? Why did it succeed? And is there a lesson to learn from that and extend it to other sectors of our economy? I must add here 2 more things, that in my opinion, there are 2 things that stand out post-independence that we must acknowledge. One is Sardar Patel, who unified 562 states. I read it, 562 states that the British left behind, and the British said they could remain independent, or they could join Pakistan, or they could join India. What a disaster. And if it was not for Sardar Patel, I think we would have been in lots of trouble. And I don't think we recognize Sardar Patel. His grandson, by the way, worked for me for many years. A very bright man, PhD in IT, by the way. And Sardar Patel never got the Bharat Ratna. till 1991. Hard to believe. A person who unified India was not given the Bharat Ratna for so long. The next man, I think, who really saved India and who has not been given the Bharat Ratna till today is P.V. Narasimha Rao. So starting from 1991, the country turned right. And that is what has really, in my opinion, made a very, very large difference to the Indian economy. And I really can't understand why, even till today, despite all the change of governments, we have still not recognized Narasimha Rao's contribution. Now, let me draw up a scorecard about the economic scene. We talk of China, but forget China. Let's talk of other Asian countries. India's per capita GDP is around $2,000 per person per year. Let's talk of some other Asian countries. Vietnam. Now, Vietnam had a war for 20 odd years. The French and then the Americans, and their per capita GDP today is $3,400 per person per year. Sri Lanka, who became independent at the same time as India. In fact, one time was part of India. And again, they had a civil war for 26 years, 1982 to 2009. And their per capita GDP is $3,700 as compared to $2,000 of India. Thailand, $7,200 per person per year. And then, of course, finally, China, we must talk of China, $10,500 per person per year, 5 times that of India, 5 times. And we were at the same level about 40 years ago. So when you look at the scorecard objectively, I don't think we have done well. I don't think the government of India has done well. I think we are finally on the right track. But between 47 and 91, which is 44 years, I honestly think that if we look at it dispassionately, and I'm not politically inclined myself, the fact of the matter is that we did not do well. At its peak, China grew by 14% in 1 year. 14% in 1 year. So it can be done. And our savings rate is very, very important when it comes to growth, is among the highest in the world. So there is no reason why India could not have grown much, much faster. Now let's look at the IT sector and let's see the lesson that we can learn from that sector. I wrote a project report on creating a computer software company for Tatas in 1965. And then I went back to MIT for 2 years. And in my absence, they accepted that report. And they kept pushing me to come back. And so immediately after I finished my PhD, like all Indians, I wanted to stay in America for a couple of years. I was offered the best of jobs since I had the highest grade point average in the class. But Tata made the offer of not only you can come here, you can even head the company. Offer nobody can refuse. So back I came, 1967, created, you're right, first it was called the Tata Computer Center. 1 year later, in 1968, we renamed it as Tata Consultancy Services. So that was the birth of the first software company in India. And as our compare mentioned, the total revenue
Connection's a little bit
sorry about that. I'm sorry about that. I'm helpless, I can tell you. She mentioned about 8% of India's GDP comes from the IT sector, which is a remarkable phenomenon by any standards. We employ 5.5 million people across the country and abroad. And the per capita income, if we divide the revenue by the number of people who work, is $36,000 per person per year. And if our working population generated this revenue, India's GDP would be more than $20 trillion, which would be larger than that of the United States of America. So I think those of you who are in the IT sector can congratulate themselves. What a fantastic job in every way, whether it's market share, per capita income. And if the whole country copied that model, we would have a GDP higher than the United States of America today. So I think we need to be very proud of the fact that we are in a sector which is vibrant. There are 4 companies in India which have a market cap of more than $100 billion. Reliance, HDFC, TCS, and Infosys. 2 of these, you notice, out of 4 are IT companies. So this says it all, that we've done a wonderful, wonderful job. Not only in India, IT professionals have been recognized world over. Satya Nadella, who has Microsoft. Microsoft is now $2 trillion. Or Sundar Pichai, Google, again more than $2 trillion. Arvind Krishna of IBM. And Mrs. Narayan of Adobe. And there are many more. But the fact of the matter is, not only we've been recognized in our country, we will now recognize worldwide. So I think we've done a tremendous, tremendous job. And there's so much to be proud of, and so much we can learn from this sector that can be useful to every other sector. What did we do right? And why did we succeed? Let me give you some of my thoughts, and you probably will have more. First is the law of comparative advantage. Economists tell you that you must play on your comparative advantage. Saudi Arabia has oil, so it can leverage that, for example. And that every country has got some comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is we have a very large, highly trained, highly educated population, though the illiteracy is still 25%. And they're at a wage which was peanuts as compared to American wage. So we leveraged the comparative advantage. This is the first time there was no government interference, none. No licenses, no permissions. You may be surprised that the customs collector, many of them used to come to my office and ask me, how do you export software? And I said, through the telephone lines, through modems. So how can I stop it? And I said, you can't stop it. He said, how is that possible? But the whole attitude of the government is one of control. They were not trying to say, how do you facilitate it? How do we control it? Then we played like an orchestra, in my opinion. This is the first time that all sectors played like a well-tuned orchestra, including the government, no license or permissions. The government introduced technology parks, starting with SEEPs, but you could make your own office into a technology park. A wonderful initiative. The universities played ball. They introduced computer sciences, almost all of them. We now produce more computer science graduates than every other country in the world. And believe it or not, they introduced a 10-year tax holiday. Unheard of. All right, wonderful sector. Let's encourage you. 10-year, no tax. Generally, when a sector makes money and makes a profit, the finance minister, first thing the finance minister does is tax the sector. This sector that made money, and the government said, no tax. And then God came to our rescue with Y2K. So God has those who help themselves. So they came in, and Y2K was a big, big boon for the country, and India rose to that challenge, as all of us know. Next, there is meritocracy in this sector. You see, most of the people in the sector, Azim Premji or Narayan Murthy or Shiv Nadar, they're all professionals. So I think this is one sector that recognized meritocracy for its development. And that made a huge, huge difference. So I can tell you, IT has so many more things I can talk about, but there are so many things that IT did and that we have done and the government has done that can set an example for all the other sectors. So what would I recommend? First is that the government has a twin role, which I don't think it understands. One role is that of promotion and the other is that of regulation. Now, these two roles cannot be combined into the same minister. In my opinion, it's not possible. So you should have a minister of regulation, you should have a minister of promotion. If we do that, I think it'll make a huge, huge difference. Two, our entire political system, which includes the ministers and the bureaucrats, don't understand domain. They don't understand the subject. Now, if you don't understand the subject, how can you run that ministry? I fail to understand that. So I would strongly recommend that, like the United States, the Prime Minister have the option to choose the best in the country to head the minister, head that particular ministry, and then use the Rajya Sabha route, which they do once in a while, to get him into the parliament and then make him minister of that sector. That's the other recommendation I have. Reduce red tape and permissions and licenses. The best government is that which governs the least. It's a maxim that you hear all the time. So we need to reduce red tape to the extent we can, eliminate permissions and licenses. Next, improve the ease of doing business. Even today, due to COVID, I am bound in my apartment, but I sign maybe 20, 30 documents every day. It's ridiculous. If you look at, I led a delegation to Germany a few years ago, and they said that any permission license to set up a company less than 5 days. Less than 5 days. Here it takes forever. Next, have stable economic policies. Very, 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 very important. So see, if your economic policy change every year, a businessman cannot plan. Next, I think we need to somehow spend far more money on education. You may be surprised to know in Sri Lanka, all education is free of cost. I repeat, all education is free of cost. In most Scandinavian countries, education is free of cost. In Germany, education is virtually free of cost. And education has a direct bearing on the economic growth of a country. So therefore, I think the government of India needs to spend far more attention to education and to somehow make it free if it can. If Sri Lanka can, why can't we make it free of cost? I see no reason why that cannot be done. So that's the other recommendation I have. What else can we do? Here's a radical suggestion. We should introduce differential income tax rates for different sectors. Sri Lanka, by the way, has done this. Why should all the sectors be taxed at the same rate? An extreme case was IT, where it was zero tax for 10 years. But for example, we are the largest producer of two-wheelers in the world today. I told Suresh Prabhu, who was then Minister of Commerce, and he spent half a day with me, that why don't you introduce a similar thing for two-wheeler exports? And he said, I agree with you, but the finance ministry won't allow that. So according to me, we should look at sectors where we are dominant, like two-wheelers, like milk. We produce more milk than every other country in the world. So why can't we leverage that advantage that we have to become milk? Like, we can't export milk per se, but we can export powder milk or cheese or chocolate. So there's no reason why that cannot be done. Next item, that you must encourage exports. I've talked to the economic advisor of the government many times, and I've told him that every country that developed post-World War II has relied on exports. It cannot be a coincidence. Post-World War II, Japan relied on exports. Germany relied on exports. Taiwan, export. Korea, again export. China, again export. So I think we need to somehow encourage exports, set up more export zones, give them a larger tax holiday. It doesn't impact the Indian economy. It should, in fact, the introductory clause for the export zone was they should be treated like a country outside India. So if it's a country outside India and you give them no income tax, it doesn't impact India in any way. So I think we should certainly encourage exports. And I think our political system needs to be overhauled in many ways, but that's a different subject altogether. We can talk about it differently, but I think it needs a complete overhaul. I can tell you, I've talked to politicians, and I don't want to name people, and told them, why do you oppose this particular bill? So it is good. And they said, Dr. Kanodia, yes, it is good. Why do you oppose it? And the answer is very funny. The answer is we are the opposition. So we have to oppose everything that the government says. It's not a question of right or wrong. The job of the opposition is to oppose, which I think is in my opinion, it is ridiculous. So I think, gentlemen, I have spent my half an hour, which is what is targeted. In fact, I've exceeded by a few minutes. I am very passionate about both these subjects. IT has been my career for 50 years. I'm an economist by training. And putting these together, I think, can make a significant difference to India, in my opinion. So I've given you some of my thoughts, random thoughts, which I hope I can set you thinking as to how we can become a powerhouse. The good news is we are one of the 7 largest GDP in the world today. USA, China, Japan, Germany, and the next 3 are very close: UK, France, and India. But we are certainly among the top 7, and I'm sure we'll overtake UK and France, and we become number 5. So that's on the positive side. But I'm sure that we can get to the number 2 or number 3 spots very quickly if we put in the right policy into place. We are very talented people. Every one of my audience is talented. Every Indian does so brilliantly when he goes abroad. There's something right about this country and its genes. And I think if we harness them, I see no reason why we cannot get right up there. So thank you for listening to me. I'll be happy to answer any question that you have and welcome any suggestions, any thoughts on how we can make our country great once again. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Kanodia. And as he mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free, or any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll now invite my co-host, Dr. Aman Agarwal, to kick off the discussions or any question and the question and answer section. Dr. Agarwal?
Thank you, Jaya, for that handover. Thank you, Dr. Kanodia, for an excellent overview. In fact, in the gist, you clubbed the last 100 years of India's growth even more, because the way you brought in the history and the way India grew from where it was and the kind of complexities we had seen was tremendous. You have lived some of those complexities in your life, so you can share them on first hand, as against some of us who have read in books and can only share that knowledge of the books. And I would like to, we have some questions which are coming forth, but before I go forth, I thought I'd just spend a minute or two, if Dr. Kanodia permits, to deliberate on what he has said and maybe add 1 or 2 more points.
Please, you're most welcome.
In addition to what Dr. Kanodia said. But I think he's very much right in terms of, proposing and voting for the fact that business needs to be growth, and that India has been able to achieve stability in terms of stable democracy and managing one of the largest nations in the world with a multicultural and multilingual framework. And certainly I was happy that he talked about the currency valuation at 1947. Although the data which I have was a little different, we were actually $2 for a rupee. We were more stronger than a dollar at 1947. And after that, after about a year or two, it fell down to what Dr. Kanodia said, and it started falling after that. And if we are able to, strengthen our rupee, if the central bank does it back again, which is the pressure for the currency going on already, then we would rise faster, and our per capita income, as he pointed out, will also rise. Just to add on to his figures, which he made, were very correct, and I think we have been sticking on to that $2,000 per capita for a long time now, not letting it go at all. We were stuck to about $1,200 to $1,400 per capita for almost about 15 years, and again now for the last 10, 12 years, we're stuck on to $2,000. Fortunately, on the PPP mode, we are still a little higher. We are around $7,333. For common persons who do not understand PPP, would mean what my rupee can buy for me. In terms of real capital goods and services which one can buy using a rupee, it is equivalent to $7,333 gained by anyone across the globe. So that's what PPP talks about. And similarly, when we look at the GDP figures, we are around the 3 billion figure. We would have been 3.5 if this corona and the COVID situation would not have been around. We would have actually surpassed 3.5, maybe 3.8 or so now. But however, we are still 3 billion plus, according to IMF data so far. And also in per capita basis, we are about $12,000 billion. So, in per capita, we are the third largest economy in the world, which, on the PPP front we are, but certainly seventh, as Dr. Kanodia said, on the notional value, and which is correct. We need to look at both, because one elevates us and makes us feel more better that what we can do, and we need to keep that in constant, because what the value of rupee can buy is very critical. We don't want to lose that power which the rupee can buy. And as I've said at various forums, including about 5 parliaments which I've addressed in the last 25 years, you see the rupee gets its value from its domestic production and consumption. People like Dr. Kanodia have created in this country. My hat's off to him. He's a man who started with 10 people way back in 1975 and has 8,000 plus people on his rolls, which he is financing. So it is roughly more than, I would say on an average, if you look at 3 people in a family, 24,000 people's mouths he is feeding through his small venture, but dedicated venture, which got laurels even from the Prime Minister of this country for his kind of product basis. Although he has, like all business, and against the regulatory framework, which is, in my opinion, very right. And what happens, and it's very bad what happens as well. And I hope India is trying to do something, as though he did point out. But I think he's very right on the fact, and he has been able to utilize that human capital, which he talked of, which we are blessed with in this country, to the right framework. I would certainly, one of my first questions after my talk would be, Dr. Kanodia, if you could highlight on some of these mantras of journey of 10 to 8,000 plus with, odd kind of regulatory, horrors all around. If you could enlighten us and our viewers here on some of those facts of your journey of life, that will be great. I think the rest of it is very true. Although he talked about the export-led growth, India is very much in-house based country. Given this size, we could not actually go in for exports because our exports were very inelastic from the very beginning of our independence. However, our imports have been always inelastic in nature, and our exports were all elastic in nature. Although when we got our journey in terms of trade internationally, India's mark was so high that any trader from any across the world, in Europe also, would say, if it's come from India, just buy it at whatever price. So we had an inelastic exports, which Dr. Kanodia referred to in a way, which was there in the historic India, but then we have not been able to gain that situation again for a long time, because that requires a high level of quality to be dispersed on the ground. And we are known for it. I think we are going ahead with it, with the government's initiatives, the programs, and with the support of industrialists like Dr. Kanodia. I'm happy that I can be proud of the fact that he has been a teacher himself, and that we could see from his address today, because for about 2 years after he finished his studies, he did teach. And that is something which makes me feel proud, because an industrialist starting his journey as a teacher, we have had many of them I know personally who have done the same, have been fairly well. And I think that's a real groundwork which values the kind of dedication and the front we can bring in from human capital. And I think that's where it comes from. As I said, Dr. Kanodia, I would really appreciate if you could hint upon this journey from 10 to 8,000 plus. So some of our entrepreneurial people who are sitting here could, foresee themselves in another 20, 25 years to be following your footsteps in terms of leading India into what Dr. Narendra Modi says, Mr. Narendra Modi says, of $5 trillion economy, soon maybe 10 or maybe 15 trillion in due course, and rubbing the top 3 not only in purchasing power but in the real nominal value as well. Dr. Kanodia.
Thank you, Professor Agarwal. Very meaningful comments, and I agree with him that PPP may be a better measure of the economy rather than the notional GDP. He's absolutely right. And on PPP, we are already number 3. That is absolutely correct. So in a way, we have done well. Let me talk about my journey. Incidentally, we are now about 12,000 people.
Okay.
So we've sort of grown, and the family, we come from an exceptional family of educated people. In my family, 7 of us have PhDs. 7 or 8 of us graduated from IIT Bombay, and 5 are MIT graduates. So I think Lady Luck, God has been kind to us. That is our main asset, and we could leverage that asset to harness growth. But I come from a very modest background when it comes to the family background, and we didn't have adequate funds to fuel our growth. And I think I made the huge mistake of not going public much earlier than we should have. Now, when you have very limited funds, as all of you know, it's very difficult to fuel growth in our country. So God has been kind. We have grown steadily over the years. And the family, of course, has done exceptionally well because we are not only into IT. We run a domestic airline in the United States, by the way, called the Trans-State Airlines. And the family has just put up a 1.3 million ton urea plant in Durgapur. So in that sense, I think we've done okay. We could have done better, but everybody can do better. So I've been very fortunate. I've made lots of mistakes, I can assure you. But that's another session. As president of IMC, I ran a whole series of lectures where we had very distinguished speakers. And I told them, I want you to speak to students and tell them what you did right, and more important, what you did wrong. Now, that is a very unusual request. But I can tell you a lot of the speakers, I won't name them, but we had some very distinguished industrialists and businessmen who spoke the heart out. So I've made mistakes, something right, something wrong, but I think we have done all right. Today, it's much easier. For those of you who want to become businessmen, there were no PE funds in those days. There was no venture capital in those days. Banks would not give you money. They wanted collateral. If you had no collateral, you couldn't get money. But the world has changed. And now you find unicorns springing up left, right, and center. If you open the newspaper, there's a new unicorn. So I think I would encourage, because the future of this country depends on people who are entrepreneurs, who can create jobs, who can raise the GDP. And I think we have all the apparatus now in this country to do that, which was not possible when I started my career. So I would encourage, I repeat, every one of you who wants to become an entrepreneur, it's the right time. Markets are good, money is freely available. There's so much money, you won't believe it. I'll tell you without naming the bank. I had a bank come to me saying that we want to lend you money. And I said, we don't need money. He said, but we have so much money, so we'll give it to you at 3.5%. Can you believe it? And I still kept saying no, but they insisted and I took it. Because I could buy a bond at 5% or 6% interest, and I could borrow money at 3.5%. So the point I'm trying to make is there's enough liquidity in the system to be able to finance anything that you want to do. And there are enough PE funds out there who will be ready to finance. There are enough venture capital who are looking for opportunities. So I would encourage anybody who's listening to me who wants to go into business, it's the right time, do it.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kanodia. Another thing which puzzles me is you mentioned about the stable economic policy which is there. You've seen 7 decades of governments, not one government, but multiple governments change, business environments change. And I'm happy that you outlined some of the key essential factors which this government has done. Now, given the fact that both the government and RBI has been fairly stable in terms of their monetary policy outlook, as well as the fiscal policy framework which they're putting forward, how do you see the things going forward, in the near future from the industrialist point perspective?
Well, I again would endorse what Dr. Agarwal has said, that the last 2 or 3 years, our monetary policies, which is governed by the Reserve Bank, and the fiscal policies governed by the Ministry of Finance, have been fairly stable. Having lived in America for some time, you may be surprised to know, if you ask the average American about the budget of the United States, you will see that you will draw a blank. They don't even understand that word. So this word budget has become a paranoia for us Indians. And the finance minister is always under pressure because the budget, he or she has to do something. I see no reason why these changes should be made at the time of the budget. But that's a very drastic change. And I'm not sure India is ready and prepared for that. But the fact of the matter is that all fiscal policies, monetary policies can change because of many reasons, which Professor Agarwal can talk about, I'm sure. But fiscal policy should be stable because the businessman cannot plan what he's doing if the fiscal policies are unstable. So I think the last budget of Sitaraman, I think I give a full credit for that. Stability is the name of the game. And I hope the government continues with this. Also, there's always a desire to mop up funds. So whenever you see a surplus, it's natural. If I was the finance minister, I would have done the same thing. Let us tax that sector, which I think is incorrect. If a sector is doing well, you should let it grow and not drain it out. But these are very complex problems. The population that pays taxes in India is very low. Thanks to GST now, at least the collection has more than $1.5 trillion a month rupees that they collect, which is very good in my opinion. So let's hope for the best. I think we'll mature. I have a lot of hope, and I think we've a fairly reasonably bright people now. The economic advisors, I think, are doing a good job. And if this continues, I think we're on the right road. Even this year, the forecast is that we'll be the fastest growing large economy in the world. I'm talking about the World Bank and the IMF saying that. So I think we have a house in order, in my opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Kanodia. I do have one or two more questions, if time permits, if Joya permits. One was that artificial intelligence is sweeping away things happening around the globe, whether we look at softwares or the way we are looking at lives going forward. And unfortunately, maybe the back-end support still comes from India, but then it's the European and the Americans which are taking away the shine for artificial intelligence. Given the background and the way you created the IT framework beginning in the early 70s, both at the TECS and even at your own firm, how do you see this and the Indian firms coping up with this AI framework structures?
Well, see, AI is a part of human progress. It is different, yes, but it is part of the same chain of development. Friedman in his book says that the whole economic basis on our development is based on a very simple sentence, and I'll use that sentence: doing more with less. I think it's a brilliant definition of what we are trying to do. With the same resource, the same amount of money, or the same factory, or the same office, can we produce more? And artificial intelligence is part of that chain. People are scared of it. What will we humans do? But I can tell you, we humans are far above that. I would not worry about that in any way. And a lot of the AI developers, even in America, are Indians, by the way.
Yes.
So they may be expats, the NRIs, but we are second to none when it comes to basic intelligence, basic DNA, historically over the last 3,000 years. And I can give you 100 examples on another talk as to what we have done and has not been written about and has not been recognized. And we did things much before the Western world did, but somebody should write about it. So I would not worry about AI. AI is part of that chain, and it will have an impact on us, but we'll find other ways of occupying ourselves. I don't doubt that.
Thank you, Dr. Kanodia. Just my last question, if your permits. You see, you talked about education and the way, and I'm very happy that you mentioned the talk in it because it's a very critical area, and in any case, very close to my heart because I am associated with an education institution myself. And you talked about the spending of education being free in various countries, including Sri Lanka, Europe, Nordic countries in particular. But sir, the taxation framework in most of these countries is very high. almost to the tune of about 65 to 75% is what they tax people, and then provide some of these services, including education and healthcare, free of cost. Now, in India, at the time of independence, we had a taxation structure of 98%. We've been able to bring it down to the lowest in the world today. But what will be the way out? Because going up with taxation and providing that free education will not be the way. But then what could be the way out? Although the government did trial the CSR method, but that's still not worked. It's actually moving from one pocket to the other, not promoting education per se, as you rightly pointed out, sir.
Professor Agarwal, if you go to basics, and if you ever I've never seen a study like this, but if you plot the level of education, howsoever measured, against the economic development of a country, I think you'll find a very strong correlation between these two factors. So I think good education is directly proportional to the per capita income, per GDP of a country, howsoever measured. I have not done this, but I would suggest, and I would like you to maybe take on the lead, to see how Sri Lanka has been able to do this. Now, Sri Lanka is a similar economy like India. We had the same per capita income when we became independent. They've had a civil war for a very long period of time. How is it that a country like that has been able to raise its per capita GDP to more than 50% more of India and give free education? How has it done that? And by the way, there's free health. I don't know if you know this, including organ transplant. I led a delegation to Sri Lanka when I was president of IMC, and the minister hosted us, by the way, to my great surprise. He said, I would like to host a dinner for you, so we all went there. And I was shocked to hear this. Free health, free education. And the per capita income, per capita GDP is 50% more than of India. So how have they done it? I would really encourage you to write a paper on that, and I would love to read it.
Sure, certainly. We would certainly be happy to take that up and try and find solutions to the main cause of concern, which actually is bringing the country and its growth down. There is one more question which has come, if Jay permits me, the last question maybe if you can take, which is, what suggestions would you like to give to young generation for the upliftment of better life in the digital world for stable economic development?
Well, I think you have to really get to fundamentals. If you are young, and I suspect the person who's asked this question must be young. I'm guessing, I don't know who it is. I think there's no substitute for hard work. So passion, I think passion and hard work are very important. If you read Jack Welch's autobiography, which I've read many times, or a Lou Gerstner biography, which also I've read many times, they will talk about these two factors throughout the book. That you must be passionate about what you want to do, whatever it be. And hard work when you're young, particularly. And I think if you do that, whether it's a digital economy or an agricultural economy or a manufacturing economy, you will succeed. Now, digital is the flavor of the day. That is correct. So I think all of us want to become digital, and we can see news, large wealth being created. But I see no reason why other sectors cannot do the same. India is wide open. There's opportunity. You look around you, all you see is opportunity. We don't manufacture most of the things that we should be manufacturing. Chemicals, example. Even textiles, for example. We're the world number one, but now many countries have overtaken us. China is much ahead. But even Bangladesh makes more garments, example. Or Sri Lanka makes more garments. Thailand and so on. So I think there's opportunity all around us. So don't worry. Do whatever your passion is. Whatever that be, you will succeed. And then give it a good hard shot.
Thank you, Dr. Kanodia, for those blessing words for every one of us. Each one of us is young at heart. And as many of my colleagues who are even in the 70s and the 80s and some in the early 90s say, I am still a young boy of 20. So, that's the way the spirit has to be, and you put the spirit on the ground. I would like to thank you for taking time out for discussing some of these key critical issues, enlightening us. I think these motivate us. Your words go very long in terms of our understanding of how the way should be and the way life should go forward. I would also like to thank Joya, Ashok, the Intera IT team, who has been actually keeping this environment safe, not to be hijacked by some rookie who could hack in and do things, and let us have a more peaceful environment. I think I would like to thank them as well. My smiling faces, some of whom I can see on the screen, who are enlightened souls and are still feeling fresh. I know if it was a real meeting, they would be still clubbing on to wanting to ask questions and even take pictures with you, with your legendary framework, which is there. But we have to bring an end to the session. We would request Ashok and Joya to request you to give us some time in due course again and discuss on some of the other intricate issues of business and life and the way it should be and the way you have seen it from close corners. But the insight you gave us today is a blessing in disguise. Thank you, Dr. Kanodia. And thank you, everybody, for being here, including the press members and others. Namaskar. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.
Thank you, everyone.